Gonna get started.
This is Unfragmented, inspired by Colossians. For by him were all things created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. Join our book club as we pursue a more consistent Christian life.
All right, well, welcome once again to Unfragmented, where Lee Bortons and I, Kevin Novak, explore the cohesion of things believed with things done. So we're interested in thinking about Christian thought and then putting that into action. Today, of course, is Thursday, April 27th, 2023. I'm Kevin Novak, and we have Lee Bortons here, our co-host. And today, we're going to complete our month-long journey through Henry Hazlitt's book, Economics in One Lesson. It's been really good so far. And just to let you know that next week we will start our discussion on Is Public Education Necessary? That's by Samuel Blumenfeld. And we do hope to be joined by a special guest next week, Charles Moskowitz, who was an associate or colleague, I believe, a friend of Samuel Blumenfeld. And so we hope you can join us next week, and I definitely look forward to that. This week, we also have a special guest. It is Dr. Timothy Terrell, and he, if I can introduce him briefly here, is on the faculty at Wofford College in Spartanburg, South Carolina. He's been there since 2000, where he is T.B. Stackhouse Professor of Economics. He teaches principles of economics, public finance, regulation, American economic history, and other courses. And he's also a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. Now, when he shared his biographical information with me, I was very interested to see that he does some blogging at the Machen Seminar, and I'd never heard of that website, so I look forward to investigating that a little more. He did his undergraduate and graduate studies in economics at Clemson, and then his PhD in economics at Auburn University. And sir, I just welcome you to Unfragmented, and thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
You know, I do want to inquire initially about just a few things, and then we'll get to some other questions. But I first want to ask you, of course, how you came to be involved with Henry Hazlitt, and then if you could, at the same time, just talk about some of the parts of this particular book that are influential to how you communicate with younger people, especially your students.
Yeah, so it's actually difficult for me to remember when I first came across this book. In fact, as I was looking for a copy to review prior to our podcast here, I found my old, I don't know, this is the 1979 edition with a cover that I think might be from 1990 or something. Uh-huh. So, and I've got my tabs and everything all through this that I found, and I thought, well, you know, I must have thought, and I've got some red underlining in here, and it's really, it's a fantastic book because even though it's an old book, it really gets at some of the things that are still current today, still some of the same mistakes and how people think that we're confronting and trying to deal with now. And so when I read this, for the first time, I was in my economic studies. I can't remember if I was doing my undergrad or if I was in grad school at the time, but I was looking forward to teaching. And for somebody just starting out to try to communicate about economic fallacies to 20-something-year-olds, this is really a great place to start. And it's so accessible, maybe because Hazlitt was a journalist and he wrote a lot for the Wall Street Journal and some other places. And so maybe his communication style is better suited than a kind of a dry textbook presentation that you might see some other places. And that appealed to me because I really wanted to be an effective communicator. And a lot of the ways that he puts things in the book are just so effective in a non-technical way, getting to some of these issues that I think are still just vital and so badly misunderstood. It's easy to understand why this book has such a long-lasting appeal.
Well, and I've recently been diving into some of Thomas Sowell's material, and I'm a little mad at myself for it taking me so long to get to him, but I only have so much bandwidth. But he is just so simple and intelligent that I just, it's refreshing, and he makes economics for someone like me, who I think I understand it. I can be probably a little more long-winded than someone like him, and also Henry Hazlitt. I do want to ask, though, do you happen to know if Henry Hazlitt was a Christian? And then also, are you finding, or have you found over the years, that Henry Hazlitt's principles do comport with biblical principles?
Well, before I answer that, I want to say that you mentioned Thomas Sowell, and I actually, when I was reviewing this, I thought about Thomas Sowell again, because I assigned to some of my students some pieces out of Thomas Sowell's book, Applied Economics. And it's a great book. And he talks in that book about stage 1 and stage 2 thinking. And he says, look, people are thinking about stage 1. They're not thinking about the secondary consequences, the tertiary consequences, and so on. They're just thinking about the immediate. And that really is a reflection of what Hazlitt was saying. I can't help but think that Sowell must have been tremendously influenced by what Hazlitt was saying in Economics in One Lesson. And of course, you have to go back to Frederick Bastiat, who Hazlitt credits early in this book, and the seen and the unseen, the things that you see immediately, and the things that only show up later that you might not have thought about if you weren't carefully thinking things through. But you had asked about whether I thought Hazlitt was a Christian. I really don't know much about Hazlitt personally. I have, I've read this book, and this book, of course, has been very helpful to me. And I didn't see anything in this that conflicts with my idea of what, how a Christian should think about economics. It's, of course, you're getting into deep waters when you try to say, well, what's the Christian view of economics? And there's a lot of dispute about that. But in my view, the idea of Christian liberty is pretty important. That we are free morally, where we are not constrained by what Scripture tells us. And I think a lot of the errors that people make, that Christians make when they approach economics, is that they begin to take things or say that things are required of us as Christians that are not actually required. So I see students that write papers on say the minimum wage, which Hazlitt talks about, and they'll say, well, we're supposed to care for the poor, and therefore we should have a minimum wage, or we should increase the minimum wage. And there's a couple of ways you can deal with that. One of which is, from a Christian perspective, you can say, well, where in the Bible do we see that God gave the civil magistrate the authority to tell people what their wages ought to be? I mean, I haven't seen that. And the other way to handle that, I think, which is a complementary approach, is the one that Hazlitt mentions, is to say, well, look, if you really do care about the poor, you want to think about not just the immediate effect of seeing an increase in wages. You want to think about what's going to happen once that employer realizes that this employee is now more expensive. And, an employer has to stay afloat financially, which means that they can't afford to pay a worker more than that worker is producing for the business. And so that means that the worker may well end up unemployed. And is that really caring for the poor to create a situation which is going to result in this person being out of work? I mean, that's not exactly the effect that was intended by the minimum wage, but it is the effect that we can predict. And so I think coming at this from a Christian perspective, I think we have to think about those kind of secondary consequences. Consider the cost of our actions, not just the immediate effect or the effect that we hope to have, but the effect that we'll actually have. The consequences are important.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
Yeah, that's really good. If you don't mind, just one other question. I am curious about your students. Obviously with Lee and Classical Conversations, and with some of the work that I do, we tend to focus more on younger people. When you are teaching your people at the collegiate level, what kind of reception are you seeing with Hazlitt? Are you especially over the years? Has there been a trend? Are they receptive and so on?
I have to confess, I haven't actually used Hazlitt in my college classrooms in some time, although after I reviewed this in preparation for my for this event, I thought, well, I need to bring this back. I feel like, though, in looking through Hazlitt's book, I feel like I've been talking in a Hazlitt-like fashion, although not explicitly requiring the reading from him or quoting him. A lot of the arguments that I saw, again, as I went through this, are arguments that I recognize that I make all the time in a classroom. Reading about tariffs, which maybe we can talk about that later, but in reading his chapter on tariffs, I thought, well, I say this in the classroom all the time, and it's probably because I absorbed this from Hazlitt when I was, 20 years old or 22 years old or something, and it became a part of my own thinking so much that I've forgotten that was Hazlitt. But I will say, that I get students that are really good students, and they, many of them are willing to think carefully about some of these things and are eager for another perspective. Maybe they've never heard this kind of thing before. What they have heard is often, I guess a word would be mythological. If you're getting your economics from memes and social media and all of that kind of stuff, it's probably going to be wrong. And if you're getting it from, the typical news magazine or a newspaper, it's probably going to be wrong. And it can be frustrating for economists, because I feel like half of my job is trying to undo some of the errors that they've kind of absorbed in K through 12. So I'm really glad to see an interest among homeschooling families, especially. And last fall, I homeschooled my two nephews. My sister homeschools her kids, and she said, would you teach them economics? And I said, well, yeah, sure. And so that was an experience that I enjoyed, getting to kind of familiarize myself with what's a 10th grader, 12th grader going to be thinking about some of these kinds of issues if I presented at that level. And they picked it up. They immediately grasped what I was trying to get across, and it was really encouraging to see that. And I think that students that you can't give a student I shouldn't say that. I have trouble giving a student curiosity. I feel like that's something that I'm challenged to try to encourage in a student. But if they've got that curiosity and they're willing to pick up something extra and read it, then this is a great place to start. Hazlitt is there are a few other books which maybe I'll mention later on. If you like Hazlitt, maybe you'd also like several others that I'll mention, but that's a great place to start to try to get a student prepared for college. I mean, if they came into my classroom having absorbed economics in one lesson, half my job would be done. I'd have to teach them the technical stuff, the supply and demand curves and some other things, but not having to undo error would put that student pretty far ahead, as far as I'm concerned, in my principles classes.
So I have a couple questions. Can I interrupt, Kevin, and then we'll go back to your list?
Sure, go ahead, Lee. That's great.
I appreciate what you said about the homeschooling and Kevin's question about the students you have now. How long have you been teaching first? Like,
I started my first independent college teaching when I was a upper level graduate student at Auburn in 1997.
all right. So tell us about the changes you've seen in the students in your economics classes over that 40 years or 25 years.
Well, I've taught at several places, but I've been the longest here at Wofford, and I started at Wofford in 2000. So that's almost a quarter century. And I would say it's hard because it's like the frog in the pot of water is it. I see these changes very gradually. And I still see a core of students that are a real pleasure to teach, and it's really rewarding from my perspective. And I don't need very many of those students to really be encouraged by the process as they begin to pick things up and the curiosity. I think the thing that I've been concerned about in education is really the stuff that's happening more outside the classroom that I don't have a whole lot of direct control over, and students that in some cases come in that have been affected by that kind of culture that can sometimes work against coming into economics, or I guess any subject matter, prepared to really engage in critical thinking and really begin to work through some ideas. Because and this is speculation, but I suspect part of it is that students have been accustomed more and more to being kind of handed an idea and said, this is, don't worry about thinking too carefully about it. Just here's your idea, or here's your viewpoint, and we expect you to repeat this back to us on a test. And it doesn't really pass through the brain cells on the way. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but that I've been struggling to think about this more carefully over the years. But it's almost as though there's more of a let's just memorize an idea rather than think about why that idea is right or wrong. And that has been something that I've been concerned about.
So as educators, we know what you're describing, and basically we call that grammar, and you want them to be dialectic and rhetorical. And the problem is because they don't get that dialectic and rhetorical practice as children, nobody's expecting that of them. They're reaching the age, that you're teaching, and they're still expecting it all to be grammatical. They don't even know there's this realm of deeper thought. But like, I don't even want to pick on like this generation, because what was interesting to me in reading Hazlitt's Economics in one lesson, and then another podcast I'm on, we were reading James Madison together. This problem of not being able to see the unseen, it's a problem just of human nature. It's not something this generation is doing any worse or better than any others. Would you agree or disagree with that statement?
No, I agree. And since you mentioned the trivium, I thought, oh, well, I just actually was thinking about that the other day, and I don't know why that didn't pop into my head. But yes, I mean, I feel like I'm still dealing with the early stage of that, the grammar and the logic. And the logic itself is a little bit weak in some cases. And then, and I'd love to get to the rhetoric stage, but then that's where I'm at. I'm teaching them the things that I wish they were coming into the classroom with. I'm sure that anybody who's an educator can say the same thing. They can say, well, look, I wish they were coming into my classroom already knowing X, Y, and Z, and I feel like I'm having to teach things that should have been taught earlier. And I don't know where it's going to go. I get, we could go off on a rabbit trail on AI and some of the impact that I've already seen with some of that in the last few months. But yeah.
Well, tell us that. What have you seen? We'd like to know what's going on in education. and then let me, before you answer that, though, just kind of share with our audience that's listening, for those of you that aren't in classical conversations, or maybe your children are younger, if you look at all of our literature in Challenge ABN1, which are middle school years, it's all based on freedom, a coming of age, children making the right decisions with the family behind them supporting it. And then, of course, our Challenge 1 year is all about freedom, and free market economics is a major aspect of what we teach our 14, 15-year-olds. And then, of course, we just build on that through the Challenge 2, 3, and 4 years. So I'm just curious, Terrell, Tim, if said your last name, if your CC student seems to be at all dialectic or, rhetorical. And then for folks to know that we get that the grammar is what is difficult whenever you're learning something new, but it is nice as a teacher to know that they've had some experience with that dialectic and rhetoric. So I just want to let our listeners know that. Now go ahead and answer my question, which I forgot what it was.
Well,
AI, yeah.
AI, that one, tell us.
Right. So it's a little early yet, and I'm not sure how this is going to go. I don't think any of us are really sure in higher ed how this is going to end up playing out, but it is actually amazing how good of an essay AI can create. And I actually did a special course in January where, and ChatGPT, which I guess is the most famous of these kinds of interfaces, had just appeared a couple of months before. And so in January, here I am with this class where I decided I'm going to try to see what I can do with this. Because I think, like a lot of new technologies, it's got its positives and its negatives. So I said, all right, students, what I want you to do is I want you to feed a question into ChatGPT, generate a response, and then I want you to criticize the response. I want you to show me where it falls short. What did it get right? What did it get wrong? And then go from there. And hopefully that would help them to see, first of all, it is a very flawed system, especially on economics. I played around with it a little bit when it was maybe 4 months ago. I was playing around with it a little bit and trying to feed it some questions on economics. And what it would do is just give a kind of a summary of what, like a mashup of different thinking that existed on the internet somewhere. And it just refused to take a position on the issue. So if I say, well, is the minimum wage a good idea, or something of that nature? I'm refined the question a little bit more than that. But if I asked it about the minimum wage, it would basically do what I think it was it Herbert Hoover? I can't remember now who it was that complained about economists who were always saying, well, on the one hand this and on the other hand that. And just give me a straight answer. And it was very frustrating on that score. So it didn't really satisfy me. It certainly was not at that rhetoric stage, right, where it could form an argument and defend the argument. And it was more of a reflection of what everybody else was already saying, and not a terribly deep reflection at that. And you had asked me, I think, about, I think before we started this evening, I had mentioned that I had a classical conversation student in my class, and you had asked, well, am I seeing differences there? And I would say yes, very striking abilities to digest material and think carefully about it. And that's not something that's a skill that's developed instantly. That takes many years. And so that's something that I'm encouraged by. I think that's indicative of the kind of some of those benefits of a classical education, especially homeschool classical education, is that ability to develop those kinds of skills. So I'm really encouraged by that.
Thank you. Yeah, because one thing I always say, like, we're just providing a spine. We're giving parents an opportunity to have friends to help them in the homeschooling endeavor. We've got this curriculum we curated that people study for thousands of years. And as long as the parent and the child do the work, they're going to be headed in the right direction. But we can't claim any really success from any of the families or students, because if they don't, dig in and really act as a family and work together, our curriculum's no better than anybody else's. And it's really interesting to me how the whole world wants to make every charter school, government school, new state college be classical. And they don't understand you can't separate that from faith and family values. It's you have to have that morality behind it, or it doesn't work. You have to have that work ethic.
Yeah, I would say that intellectual curiosity is something that flows out of a moral sensibility. Mm-hmm. And if you really think about if you feel like you've got a calling to make a contribution to the world around you, you need to be able to think carefully about the world, its consequences, the patterns that we can observe in the world. I mean, Hazlitt's talking about the unseen consequences of our behavior. We need to learn to think carefully about those kinds of things, and I do think that dovetails very nicely with Christian moral thinking.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Kevin, you want to go back to your questions, or Julie, did you have anybody? Michelle, Nicole, do you have any questions? Well, if they have questions, remember you had an assignment. Before we're done, we're going to take a few minutes to talk about something in current events where people aren't seeing the secondary consequences of a decision.
One just happened this week.
Is that you, Julie?
Go ahead.
Okay, hang on.
Yes. We'll wait until later. Yeah, go ahead.
Uh-oh.
So go ahead, Kevin. Ask him your other questions.
I have a pattern of not having done my homework, but nevertheless.
Hey, it's fun to be in a book club. Yeah. It's okay if you don't get it done.
Dr. Terrell, you had mentioned earlier about, I can't remember your exact wording, but something you had said kind of triggered me thinking about jurisdiction. And that's kind of my thing. Like, what does the civil government have the authority to do? And, I like to think that I've got some good biblical precepts in presenting to people to say, well, the civil government is not allowed to do this, or they're limited in this regard, or here's a positive right that was given to the parents, or, when it comes to education, things like that. But I noticed that you teach regulations. So can you share with us, say, let's just take education, for example, or even economics, of course, because that's what we're talking about. But what are some things, some biblical concepts and precepts that you share with your students in terms of the civil government being limited to do anything? Because, of course, Rush Limbaugh used to always say it's hard to beat Santa Claus. But so how do we tell our younger people biblically, like, okay, they're limited in this regard?
Well, I first have to say, at Wofford, I have to be somewhat limited in that. It's a United Methodist school by origin, but it's not really considered part of the educational process at Wofford to draw things explicitly from a biblical foundation. And that, I think, is where the kind of argument that you see in Hazlitt can be very useful. It's not a deontological kind of argument. It's more of a consequentialist kind of argument. Mm-hmm. But I think that from my perspective as a Christian looking at the world around me, I'm thinking, okay, well, there are kind of baked in consequences to certain activities. And that's the way that God created the world. Is you're going to see if you don't think about stage 2, if you don't think about the down the road consequences that are such an important part of what Hazlitt's trying to get across, you're going to end up with some pretty bad situation. And so I know that that's a kind of a truncated view of economics, and I'm aware of that. But I find it's pretty effective for students who don't necessarily come in sharing my presuppositions, who don't share my faith. And so as I'm trying to reach them with economic ideas, I find, I'll bring something kind of Hazlitt-ish into the classroom. As I said, I haven't really quoted him much in my class, but I find myself saying these things that are really along the lines of what Economics in One Lesson is all about. And that's pretty effective. In other contexts, like my blog or something, I can say something like, I think we were talking earlier about my blog, the Machen Seminar, which I haven't contributed to in a long time. But if I get an opportunity to contribute to something like that, that's where I can bring that faith and economics together in a good way. So I have my outlets for that kind of thing, if not in the classroom every day.
Is there a certain kind of struggle your students have that they just get hung up on, that you kind of see a pattern of students coming through today? Are there just from Hazlitt or from your perspective, what are they struggling with? What do they come in with this? No, it's this way, when in reality it's not. Have you seen one particular couple?
I think there are a number of those kinds of situations. A lot of, if they leave my classroom with some misunderstandings of economics, I feel like that's partly my fault, but then I've got them for 3 hours a week for a semester, and they've had 18 to 20 something years to collect a number of kind of wrong-headed ideas. So, and I'm very much aware of the fact that I'm one of many influences over their lives at any given point. And so I'm not able to really counter all of those kinds of ideas that are coming into their heads. As I assign a paper to my seniors, a paper by an economist named Friedrich Hayek, who was a student of Mises. He won the Nobel Prize in 1974, I think. And his point in the paper that I assigned, which is a 1945 paper called The Use of Knowledge in Society. And it's a very non-technical kind of paper. But what he says is really instructive, because it helps us understand why people who get a lot of education sometimes develop a sense of arrogance about what they've learned. And I was just talking with my students yesterday in class about this. It's very compatible. It's very compatible with what Hazlitt said. And it's that they think that there's only one kind of knowledge. It's a scientific knowledge. And Hayek says, that's fine. Scientific knowledge is good. It's got its place, but it's not everything. And what is very important, Hayek points out, is the knowledge that he calls it tacit knowledge. He calls it the knowledge of the circumstances of time and place, but it's basically a knowledge that you get from experience. And if you fail to respect that kind of knowledge, then you begin to look down your nose at other people who maybe haven't read as many books as you have, or haven't got the education, the formal education that you've had. And I think that it's important to warn students who are completing a 4-year college degree to say, now, wait a minute, don't get cocky about what you've learned. have some respect for the wisdom of the ages. Have some respect for what people thousands of years before you thought about. Yeah, somebody in the chat was asking about the title of the paper. It's The Use of Knowledge in Society. It appeared in 1945 in the American Economic Review. I'm pretty sure you can find a copy online with no paywall or anything, but if you need a copy, I can send that out.
You said it's by Hayek?
Yes, by Friedrich Hayek. I don't mean to get off the subject of Hazlitt, but when I think about Hazlitt, I'm thinking about all these other people, and Hayek and Mises and Bastiat and whoever else he has a whole chapter in here on inflation, and he's basically writing about Cantillon effects from Richard Cantillon, early 1800s economist from Britain, France. Now I can't remember.
It's Britain.
Actually, I think he was Irish. Anyway,
UK.
Now I've offended everybody, But anyway, so he's talking about Cantillon effects, and the fact that when you inflate money, it doesn't just kind of evenly spread out into the economy. Like Milton Friedman actually thought about new money entering the economy like bales of cash being thrown out of a helicopter, and it sort of evenly spreads out over the economy and people kind of pick it up. And Hazlitt says that's not how inflation works at all. He says, actually, it enters the economy at a specific point, and because of that, it has different effects on different people, and some people benefit from it and other people are hurt by it. And, so I guess my point is I read Hazlitt and I immediately start thinking about all this other good stuff that I wish people would just sit and read through.
Well, I think most of the people who listen to this book club know this, but you're basically talking about the Austrian economists, right? So let's list them. So the old, of course, you can't count Bastiat. He was long before that time period, but you said already Hayek, Mises. We've mentioned Hazlitt, Hayek. They said that twice. And then some more modern ones are Sowell and sometimes Milton Friedman. I don't think he's as pure an economist as some of those other guys were. And then, is there anybody today that you would say is a really good writer on these issues?
Oh, yes. And of course, I have those of us that are Austrian economists would say, well, now, I don't know about Milton Friedman. He was good on some things. I liked his book, Capitalism and Freedom, for example. It's also another one I thought about as I was going through this. But yes, I mean there's some modern authors that I think would be really great to read. I like my friend Sean Ritenour, who just published a second book. His first one is Foundations of Economics: A Christian View, and he uses it in his classes, I think, at Grove City College.
Oh, yeah.
But I think it could be accessible as well for an upper level high school student who's interested in economics. There's a lot there, but it's a Christian view. It's an Austrian perspective on things. So Ritenour's book is really good. If you're on kind of looking at for younger readers, I'm really interested in the projects that my friend Jonathan Newman has undertaken. Jonathan Newman's a Christian. He's in the Austrian school. He's like me, he's affiliated with the Mises Institute. And he has 2 books aimed at, it's hard for me to say what age that would be, I guess, maybe anywhere from, I guess, middle school, probably middle school would be about the right age group. But it's kind of like a graphic novel kind of book, really. But it's about the broken window fallacy. And he's got another one that's coming out real soon. And it's great economic stuff that you can, it's Hazlitt for like 6th graders. And it's great stuff. So, there's I'm in danger of leaving people out that I think are very important to read that are modern authors. But I think if you're thinking about this for a high school student or for somebody that you kind of want to inoculate them against bad economics before they go off to college and get all kinds of bad economics knocked into their heads, I would say you can start them. I mean, the Tuttle Twins stuff is great. That stuff is really good for younger students if you're trying to get them good economics from the foundation. And then and my nieces who are homeschooled, I've gotten them several Tuttle Twins books, trying to make sure. And of course, my brother's on the same page I am, so he's happy to feed that to his kids. So there's a lot of great resources now if you're interested in kind of Austrian school stuff and you're interested in trying to get these things into students at an early age.
Yeah. So in Classical Conversations, we recommend, we have our students actually read the Richard Maybury books. There's no such thing as a free lunch and penny candy, as well as things like from the Foundation for Economic Education. They have a reader with lots of really good articles. There you go. Richard's a great guy.
Right here. So yeah, I've got the book hanging around my office. So
there's a lot of good books. We're also having I'm going to stop and do my ad right now. So I'm going to thank our sponsor, Classical Conversations, where families gather weekly to practice the classical model of education with the local community. Visit classicalconversations.com and use your zip code to find a CC community near you. And of course, we just had some recommendation of some good books that are on classicalconversationsbooks.com. Also on May 15th, I don't know if you know this, Tim, but Tho Bishop, who is leading the Mises Apprenticeship Program, is going to be on my Markers and Milestones podcast to explain to parents about the program there at Mises Institute that they can do in the summer with their graduates in order to really grasp more of Austrian economics. And I saw the email they've been sending out about the new program, and it looks like the students that are joining are pretty amazing. I want to go hang out with them.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm actually teaching at that this summer, Mises University, and I've been doing that for a number of years now. Tho's a great guy. He's such a great communicator and some of the stuff. I'm glad you're having him on. But Mises University would be really good for, I think if you got a senior and they're graduating, they got a summer between high school and college, and they've read enough of this stuff to really develop an interest, then send them to Mises U. And that's how I got involved in thinking about some of these things for the first time, is going to Mises U and reading some of the stuff we've talked about tonight.
Good. Okay, well, we only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to let you know I did my assignment, but then I made it up. So of course it was easy for me to do, but I want to give any of you an opportunity. So mine is, I'm actually sticking it in the chat because I know what direction we're all going in, and it almost seems unbelievable. So we've been fighting really hard against these vouchers, ESAs, public funding going into private education, and the destruction that's going to occur in the private educational world. Just today, IMG, which is one of the largest colleges in Florida, for billions of dollars, was just purchased by a Chinese company. Who will get the universal education income when Florida finishes passing that bill? When these legislators are thinking that, it's going to help Classical Conversations, or it's going to help the local classical Christian school, they're forgetting that there's private schools owned by all kinds of people, and they aren't necessarily Americans that own them in our country. So once again, they did not pay attention to the secondary consequences of we're the government and we're here to help. And so I sent the information in the chat there on that. Does anybody else found something this week? Go ahead.
I'm concerned about government funding of education, even if it looks like something that might be directed toward private education. If you're going to take the Queen's shilling, I mean, I'm concerned it might be like a Trojan horse for some of these schools, that they end up getting hooked on that government money, and it's going to end up affecting the way they teach in order to keep that flow of dollars coming. So, yeah.
Lee has a great quote: "With the shekels come the shekels." What she's taught us. I told Lee this morning, I saw, so Biden's latest executive order on the mortgage rates. Have you heard this?
I just can't even believe this.
So
I
if you
actually haven't
have
seen
a
this.
so May 1st, it goes into effect, everyone, in 4 days. If you go and have, well, so it's the government loan, so FHA or the Mac people, I don't
Freddie Mac, Fannie Mac. You have a government financed mortgage.
Yes. So if you have a credit score of 750 or higher, you will get an additional 1% added to your interest rate. And if it's less, you will get a 2.75 discount. So I just see 2007. So one of two things, it's let's all go, not worry about, let's reward the bad credit score. And two, I just see 2007 happening all over again. That's the very thing that happened. They gave out loans to people who have no business taking a loan, and we had so fiat money.
There's some Hazlitt for that, but
yeah, you would think. So that's my assignment.
Maddening.
It is maddening. It's maddening.
It is.
Well, anyone else want to share an example? Otherwise, I'll close. And Dr. Terrell, we do thank you for being on. Do you mind if I just close with some prayer here, Lee?
That'd be great.
All right, Heavenly Father, we do thank you for bringing us all together here. We know that you are with us during this time. We just pray that we can continue to learn and understand your biblical principles. We know that even people who are not necessarily Christians are suffering the consequences of going against your will and against your laws of nature. We do pray for those people. We do pray for us so we can continue to work hard and advance your kingdom and be a biblical Christian influence on others. We do thank you for Dr. Terrell and his wisdom, as well as the wisdom of all the other participants here. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right. That's the last of Hazlitt, and next week we'll start working on Blumenfeld. So thanks. Come on. He's the guy that got us all hooked on phonics. So it'll be a fun conversation. Bye.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Terrell.
Thank you.
Thank